It's March 2023, and the Capital Limited is sitting dead still somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, and it has been sitting there for almost 2 hours now. The passengers are starting to get restless. Some of them have connections to make in Washington, some of them have jobs to get to, and the conductor comes on the intercom and says what Amtrak conductors have been saying for 50 years now. We're waiting for a freight train to clear the main line. Should be moving shortly. But here's the thing that the passengers don't know. And here's the thing that would probably make them furious if they did know. That freight train they're waiting for, it's not carrying anything urgent. It's not carrying medical supplies or food or anything that anyone actually needs right now. It's carrying coal. Some of it is carrying garbage. Some of those cars rolling past the windows of the Capital Limited are completely empty. And yet somehow, those empty freight cars are more important than 200 passengers who paid good money to get somewhere on time. And the craziest part is that this isn't legal. There's a federal law been on the books since 1973 that says Amtrak trains are supposed to go first. Passenger trains get preference over freight. That's not a guideline. That's not a suggestion. That's the actual law of the United States. And the freight railroads have been ignoring it for decades because they know that nobody is going to do anything about it. The Department of Justice, the only agency that can actually enforce this law, has brought exactly 2 cases in over 50 years. 2. The first one was back in the late 1970s. The second one didn't happen until 2024. That's a gap of more than 40 years where the freight railroads could do whatever they wanted, and they knew it, and they acted accordingly. So how did we get here? How did we end up with a law that everyone ignores and a passenger rail system that runs at the mercy of companies that would rather see it disappear entirely? The answer takes you back to 1971, to a deal that seemed like a good idea at the time, and to a series of decisions that turned American passenger rail into something that exists only because the freight railroads allow it to exist. To understand why Amtrak trains spend so much time sitting on sidings waiting for freight to pass, you have to understand how Amtrak came to be in the first place. And you have to understand the deal that was made. Because that deal is the reason everything is broken today. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, the private railroads in America were losing their shirts on passenger service. The airlines were taking all the business travelers. The interstate highways were taking everyone else. And the railroads were stuck running passenger trains that lost money on every single trip because the government required them to keep running those trains whether they wanted to or not. By the late 1960s, most of the major railroads were either bankrupt or headed that way, and passenger service was bleeding them dry. So the government came up with a solution. They would create a new company, a quasi-public corporation called Amtrak, and this company would take over all intercity passenger rail service in the United States. The private railroads would be freed from the obligation to carry passengers. They could focus entirely on freight, which was the only thing that actually made money. And in exchange for handing over their passenger operations to Amtrak, the railroads agreed to let Amtrak trains run on their tracks. Amtrak would pay for the privilege, of course, but more importantly, the law said that Amtrak trains would get preference over freight trains on any rail line in the country. This was the deal. The freight railroads got what they wanted, which was freedom from the money-losing passenger business. And the passengers got what they needed, which was a guarantee that their trains would actually run on time. It seemed fair. It seemed reasonable. And for a while, it actually worked. In the early years of Amtrak, the freight railroads had so much excess capacity that adding a few passenger trains to the mix was no big deal. They had more track than they needed, more locomotives than they could use, and letting Amtrak through first didn't cost them anything. But then everything changed. In 1980, Congress passed something called the Staggers Rail Act, and this single piece of legislation transformed the American railroad industry in ways that are still playing out today. Before Staggers, the railroads were heavily regulated. The government controlled their rates, their routes, their service levels. After Staggers, they were free to charge what they wanted, free to abandon routes that didn't make money, free to focus on the most profitable traffic and ignore everything else. And the freight railroads used that freedom to get very profitable. They merged with each other until the industry consolidated down to just a handful of massive companies. They ripped up thousands of miles of track that they didn't need anymore. They cut their workforce to the bone, and they discovered something that would change everything. Freight was gold. Every train they ran, every car they moved was pure profit. And Amtrak, those passenger trains running on their tracks, was a nuisance. See, the preference law was written back when the railroads had plenty of room on their networks for everyone. But after Staggers, they started running their networks much tighter. Fewer tracks, fewer crews, fewer locomotives, but more freight. And suddenly those Amtrak trains weren't just a minor inconvenience anymore. Every time an Amtrak train went first, that was a freight train that had to wait. And every freight train that waited was money lost. The railroads started making calculations. Amtrak pays us a few $1 million a year to use our tracks. But if we prioritize freight over Amtrak, we can move more coal, more containers, more grain. The money we make from prioritizing freight is way more than what Amtrak pays us, and way more than any penalty we might face for breaking the preference law. Because here's the thing about that law. The only entity that can enforce it is the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice, for reasons that have never been fully explained, simply chose not to enforce it. For 40 years, the freight railroads broke the law every single day, and nothing happened. If you want to understand how bad this has gotten, you have to look at the numbers. Because the numbers are staggering. In 2022, freight trains caused over 1 million minutes of delay to Amtrak passengers. 1 million minutes. That's equivalent to almost 2 years of passengers sitting on trains, waiting for freight to go first. In 2023, it was 900,000 minutes. In 2024, 850,000 minutes. Every single year. The equivalent of more than a year and a half of human time, just wasted because freight railroads refuse to follow the law. And it's not like these delays are unavoidable. It's not like the freight railroads are doing their best and sometimes things just don't work out. This is deliberate. The dispatchers who control which trains move and which trains wait, they work for the freight railroads. They make decisions every single day to hold Amtrak trains so freight trains can go first. Sometimes they make Amtrak passengers follow behind a slow freight train for 50 or 100 miles, crawling along at half the speed the passenger train could be going. Sometimes they park the Amtrak train on a siding and make it wait while 3 or 4 freight trains go past. These are active choices. These are decisions that human beings make, knowing that they're breaking the law, knowing that hundreds of passengers are sitting there getting more and more frustrated. And Amtrak has tried everything to fix this. They've tried adding extra time to the schedules, building in padding, so that even if the freight railroads delay them, they can still arrive on time. But the freight railroads figured that out. When Amtrak added more time to the schedule, the freight railroads just used that extra time to delay them even more. The trains started arriving even later than before. They've tried offering financial incentives to the freight railroads, paying them bonuses for good on-time performance. The freight railroads took the money when they could get it and kept delaying trains anyway, because the money they make from prioritizing freight is still worth more than Amtrak's bonuses. A study found that if Amtrak trains could actually run on time the way they're supposed to, Amtrak could save $336 million in one-time savings, plus $42 million every single year after that. That's money that could go into better service, more routes, newer equipment. Instead, it gets burned up paying for crews that have to work overtime, equipment that sits idle, passengers that demand refunds. And then things got even worse. Starting around 2017, most of the major freight railroads adopted something called Precision Scheduled Railroading, or PSR. Now, the name makes it sound like the trains would run more precisely, more on schedule. In reality, it was a cost-cutting program designed to make Wall Street happy by squeezing every possible dollar out of the railroad's operations. Under PSR, the freight railroads cut their workforce by almost 30%. They furloughed tens of thousands of workers. They parked thousands of locomotives and let them sit. And they started running longer and longer trains, because a longer train needs the same size crew as a shorter train. So you can move more freight with fewer people. Some of these trains got ridiculous, 2 miles long, 3 miles long, trains so long can't fit in the sidings that were built for shorter trains decades ago. And here's where it gets really bad for Amtrak. When a freight train is too long to fit in a siding, it can't pull over to let the Amtrak train pass. The Amtrak train has to wait, or worse, the Amtrak train has to pull into the siding while the miles-long freight train rumbles past on the main line. The whole point of the preference law was that Amtrak trains go first. But when the freight train physically cannot get out of the way, the preference law becomes meaningless. The freight railroads know this. They know that by running longer trains, they make it harder for Amtrak to get through, and they keep doing it anyway. Because those longer trains save them money on crews and locomotives, and that savings is worth more to them than whatever complaints Amtrak might make. A recent study by the National Academies called for substantial and certain financial penalties against freight railroads that run trains too long for the available infrastructure. The study basically said what everyone already knew. The freight railroads are gaming the system. They're making business decisions that they know will hurt Amtrak, and they're getting away with it. Here's the fundamental problem with American passenger rail, the thing that makes it different from almost every other country in the world. Amtrak owns almost none of the track it operates on. Out of 21,000 route miles, Amtrak owns about 3%. The rest belongs to the freight railroads, BNSF, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX. These are the host railroads, and they control everything. They control the dispatching. They decide which trains go and which trains wait. They control the maintenance. If they let the track deteriorate, Amtrak trains have to slow down. They control the infrastructure. If they tear out a passing siding because they don't need it for freight anymore, tough luck for Amtrak. They control the whole game, and Amtrak is just a guest in their house. And it's not like Amtrak doesn't pay for this privilege. Amtrak hands over millions of dollars every year to the host railroads in exchange for trackage rights. But that money doesn't buy good service. It just buys access. The freight railroads take the money and then treat Amtrak like an afterthought. In 2018, the Amtrak started publishing something called the Host Railroad Report Card, grading each freight railroad on how much delay they cause to Amtrak passengers. The grades are not pretty. Union Pacific, one of the biggest railroads in the country, consistently gets poor marks. Norfolk Southern, the railroad that the Department of Justice finally sued in 2024, has been failing Amtrak passengers for years. The report cards are embarrassing for the freight railroads, but embarrassment doesn't change behavior. The freight railroads know that the worst thing that can happen to them is some bad publicity. There are no real consequences. They can fail Amtrak passengers every single day, and the checks from Amtrak still clear, and the freight keeps moving, and the shareholders keep getting their dividends. If you're wondering why nobody has fixed this in 50 years, you have to understand the politics involved. The freight railroads are enormously powerful. They have lobbyists in Washington. They have friends in Congress. They have lawyers who can delay any legal action for years. And they have a very simple argument that they make over and over again. If you force us to prioritize Amtrak, our freight service will suffer. And freight is how America moves goods. Freight is how the economy works. You want to slow down the supply chain just so a few hundred passengers can get to Chicago on time? It's a compelling argument if you don't think about it too hard, but the data doesn't support it. The preference law has exceptions for situations where following it would substantially delay freight operations. No railroad has ever asked for those exceptions, and when freight railroads have been forced to prioritize Amtrak, either because of specific agreements or because of regulatory pressure, there's no evidence that it hurt their freight operations. The rail network in America has plenty of capacity for both freight and passengers if the freight railroads would just follow the rules. But they don't want to follow the rules, and nobody makes them. The Surface Transportation Board, which regulates railroads, has held hearings and issued reports and expressed concern. But the board can't enforce the preference law. Only the Department of Justice can do that. And the Department of Justice, until 2024, simply refused. There are people in Washington who have been asking why for decades, and nobody has ever given a good answer. In July 2024, now something remarkable happened. The Department of Justice actually filed a lawsuit against a freight railroad for violating Amtrak's preference rights. The defendant was Norfolk Southern, and the route in question was the Crescent, which runs from New York to New Orleans. The lawsuit alleged that Norfolk Southern consistently, deliberately, and repeatedly delayed Amtrak passengers to prioritize its own freight trains. It was the first case of its kind in over 40 years. Amtrak employees were cautiously optimistic. Rail advocates were hopeful that this might finally be the turning point. But even if the lawsuit succeeds, even if Norfolk Southern is forced to change its behavior on the Crescent route, it's just one railroad and one route. What about Union Pacific? What about BNSF? What about all the other routes where freight railroads delay Amtrak every single day? One lawsuit isn't going to fix a system that's been broken for half a century. There are some people in Congress who want to give Amtrak the power to sue freight railroads directly without having to wait for the Department of Justice to act. A bill called the Rail Passenger Fairness Act would do exactly that. If it passes, Amtrak could take freight railroads to court whenever they violate the preference law. The threat of constant litigation might finally force the railroads to behave. But that bill has been introduced before, and it has never passed. The freight railroad lobby is powerful, and they have friends in high places who make sure that bills like this never get to the floor for a vote. And through all of this, and the people who suffer are the passengers, regular people who just want to take a train somewhere, business travelers who thought they could work during the trip instead of fighting traffic, families who wanted to see the country without getting on an airplane, elderly passengers who can't drive long distances anymore and don't want to deal with airport security. These are the people who sit on Amtrak trains watching freight cars roll past their windows hour after hour, wondering why they're not moving. Some of them give up on trains entirely. They say, never again. They get in their cars or they buy plane tickets, and they tell their friends that Amtrak is unreliable and not worth the trouble. And that's exactly what the freight railroads want. Every passenger who gives up on Amtrak is one less reason for the government to care about passenger rail. Every bad experience is another piece of evidence that trains don't work in America. The freight railroads don't have to lobby against Amtrak directly. They just have to make Amtrak so unreliable that it defeats itself. And the tragedy is that American passenger rail could work. It works in Europe. It works in Asia. It even works on the Northeast Corridor, the one stretch of railroad that Amtrak actually owns and controls. Trains between Boston and Washington run on time because Amtrak controls the dispatching. Amtrak decides which trains go first. And surprise, passenger trains go first, because that's what makes sense when you're running a passenger railroad. But everywhere else in the country, the Amtrak is at the mercy of companies that see it as a nuisance at best and a threat at worst. Companies that make billions of dollars a year shipping coal and chemicals in containers and resent every minute they have to share their tracks with passengers. Companies that break the law every single day because nobody stops them. So here's where it stands. There's a law on the books that says Amtrak trains go first. The freight railroads ignore it. There's a lawsuit against one railroad on one route. There's a bill in Congress that might give Amtrak the power to enforce its own rights, but that bill probably won't pass. There are report cards and hearings and studies, and everyone agrees that the situation is terrible, but nothing actually changes. Meanwhile, the Capital Limited is probably sitting on a siding somewhere right now, are waiting for a coal train, or a garbage train, or a train full of empty cars to clear the main line. The passengers are looking at their watches, making calls to the people who were supposed to pick them up, explaining that they're going to be late again. The conductor is apologizing because that's all he can do. The law says those passengers should have gone first, but nobody enforces that law, and the freight railroads know it, and so the passengers wait. They've been waiting for 50 years now. They might be waiting for 50 more. The trains are still running. They're just not running the way they're supposed to, and at this point, it's hard to imagine that they ever will.